Patterns of evolution. Here are our learning goals. Explain how speciation occurs. Compare divergent and convergent evolution. Compare punctuated evolution and gradualism. Explain how mimicry and camouflage are forms of evolution. And be able to read a phylogenetic tree or cladogram and explain the evolutionary relationships that it shows. Speciation is the formation of new species. When new species are formed or evolved, the populations in each species become reproductively isolated from each other. In other words, they can't interbreed and produce fertile offspring. They might be like a horse and a donkey, which can breed and produce offspring, a mule, but the mule is not fertile. So how does speciation occur? How do populations become reproductively isolated from each other? There are several mechanisms. One is called behavioral isolation. If organisms have differences in their courtship or reproductive strategies, that can prevent them from breeding. One example of behavioral isolation are the courtship rituals of birds of paradise in New Guinea. Here's a species of bird of paradise, and the way this male attracts females is to hang upside down from a branch, fluff out his feathers, and sing a song. This species of bird of paradise walks on top of the branch, fluffs out its feathers, and makes a loud squawking noise. Females of this species are not attracted to males of this species and vice versa. So they're reproductively isolated because of their behavior. Another possibility would be geographic isolation. Sometimes populations are just physically separated from each other. One example of geographic isolation would be if say a river changed its course and split two populations. Like this picture shows, a river's changed course and separated the trees in the forest. The trees on this side of the river are isolated from the trees on the other side. And so the animals on either side of the river would also be isolated. Now it turns out that before the Grand Canyon formed, there was one species of ground squirrel and one species of tree-living squirrel in northern Arizona. As the Grand Canyon formed, it separated ground squirrels on the northern rim and the southern rim from each other, and the same thing with the tree-living squirrels. And over time, because they were geographically isolated, they became reproductively isolated and became different species. Another isolating mechanism is temporal isolation. That's when organisms reproduce at different times of the year. One great example of that would be flowers that bloom in the springtime have absolutely no chance of pollinating flowers that bloom in the fall. There are different patterns of evolution. One of them is called divergent evolution, and that's when similar species begin to evolve to look very different from one another. And an example of that would be elephants. The woolly mammoth, which is now extinct, and the modern elephant had a common ancestor. Individuals of that original species that lived in colder climates gradually evolved shaggy hair, stocky body, and small ears to conserve heat. Members of that original species that lived in warmer climates developed very large ears. They became taller and not quite as stocky as the woolly mammoth, and virtually no hair. And this was to help them deal with hot climates. Another pattern of divergent evolution is called adaptive radiation, and a great example of that is Darwin's finches. From an original species of finch that arrived on the Galapagos Islands, 13 different species arose. So adaptive radiation, think of spokes on a wheel. All these species directly evolved from this one common ancestor. So if we put the common ancestor in the center, it's like spokes on a wheel leading to each one of the different species that it gave rise to. Another pattern of evolution is called convergent evolution. That's when distantly related organisms evolve to look more similar. So here are two deep sea animals. One of these animals is alive today, and you can order it in a restaurant. The other has been gone for millions and millions of years. The one on top is a swordfish, which you can go out in a boat and catch today. This is a dinosaur. But if you look at them, they have very, very similar features. They both have this long nose that helps break the water in front of them. They're very streamlined, just like a torpedo, so they can move very quickly through the water. They have large front fins so they can maneuver quickly, and they have this huge tail that propels them through the water very quickly. And the reason that these animals look so similar is because they lived in a similar environment and they ate similar food. These animals are adapted to live in the deep ocean and to chase very, very fast prey. Another example of convergent evolution would be to look at a bird, a bat, and a pterodactyl. All three of these animals are adapted to flight, so they have very similar body plans, but they all evolved from very different ancestors: birds, mammals, and dinosaurs. Two other patterns of evolution that we need to talk about are gradual versus punctuated evolution. Gradual evolution is slow, steady change. This is what Darwin believed was the case, that over long periods of time, small changes in an organism would gradually build up over time into big changes in new species. Punctuated evolution is similar but somewhat different. In punctuated evolution, species remain essentially unchanged for long periods of time, and then there's a brief, rapid burst of evolution that may span a very short time and result in a new species. Scientists use cladograms to show evolutionary relationships. These lines represent relationships between these organisms. The closer the organisms are together, the more closely related they are. So the salmon and the lizard are more closely related than the lizard and the shark. And the lamprey and the lizard are the most distantly related on this cladogram. The cladogram shows that they all arose from a common ancestor, and then the ancestors of the lamprey split off, and then the ancestors of the shark split off, and then the ancestors of the salmon split off, and eventually the common ancestor gave rise to the lizards. So the more closely related the organisms are, the closer they are going to be on the cladogram. So one term that we hear all the time when people talk about evolution is survival of the fittest. Now, what do we mean by that? Do we mean who's the biggest, baddest, meanest creature around? Not at all. What we mean by fitness is the ability to survive and reproduce. The fittest animals are those that survive to reproduce the most offspring. So let's look at Arnold Schwarzenegger, who at one time was Mr. Universe, who has muscles on top of muscles, and little old Barbara Bush. Barbara Bush had 6 children. Arnold Schwarzenegger has 4 children. So who's more fit in an evolutionary sense? Of course, it's Barbara Bush, because she has had more offspring and passed on her genes to more offspring in the next generation.